There's nothing explicit in the Quran prohibiting women from leading prayers, but it's not allowed in Islam. Why is that the case? And if gender equality is important, then why does Islam differentiate between men and women here? What if someone thinks this is unfair? In reality, fairness and justice is to actually give each person, each category, each group what is appropriate for them. But how do we know what's appropriate for one gender as opposed to another? Is it allowed for women to lead men in prayers? Firstly, where do we get Islamic rulings from? We get Islamic rulings from the Qur'an, we get it from the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and the consensus of Muslim scholars. This last one is important as it's going to come up in a bit. Now, there's nothing explicit in the Qur'an on this particular issue. However, if we look in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, we do find some relevant information. There is a narration reported by Abu Dawud, narrated by Waraqa radiallahu anha. The Prophet ﷺ used to visit her in her house, and the Prophet ﷺ, he assigned for her someone to call the adhan, and he commanded her to lead the members of her household. This hadith does have some weakness, but it is an accepted hadith. This hadith shows that the Prophet ﷺ allowed her to lead others. Does this mean that she led men in the household, or was it just women? There are other wordings of this hadith which state that she only led women in her home. We have other narrations where Aisha radiallahu anha and Salama led women in prayer. And because of these narrations, the vast majority of scholars, they say that it's permissible for a woman to lead other women in salah. But what about a woman leading men in salah? There is a hadith reported by Ibn Majah in his Sunan where it's reported that the Prophet ﷺ forbade a woman from leading a man in prayer. However, this hadith is inauthentic. But there is a consensus among jurists that it's not permissible for a woman to lead a man in the obligatory prayers, meaning the 5 daily prayers. It's not allowed. This is something that's not controversial, and it's agreed upon. This never occurred in the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, his companions, or during the early generations. Scholarly consensus is an important source of Islamic rulings. Now, if we open the door for opposing scholarly consensus, this might give validation to all sorts of deviated, innovated interpretations. That being said, some scholars in the past did permit a woman leading a man in optional prayers, like in Taraweeh. But this is a very weak opinion. Why? Because it's inconceivable that this would be allowed, while the Prophet ﷺ, he told us that خَيْرُ صُفُوفِ الرِّجَالِ أَوَّلُهَا, the best rows of men are the first rows. وَشَرُّهَا آخِرُهَا, and the worst rows of men are the last rows. وَخَيْرُ صُفُوفِ النِّسَاءِ آخِرُهَا, and the best rows of the women are the last rows. وَشَرُّهَا أَوَّلُهَا, and the worst of the rows of women are the first rows. Meaning, he's trying to emphasize the importance of the genders being away from each other. Now, if women were to lead the prayer, this would lead to inappropriate behavior. The congregation must not be ahead of the imam who's leading the prayer. So, if a woman were to lead the prayer, this would create an environment that could lead to inappropriate interactions. In the time of the Prophet ﷺ, a female companion, Qayla bint Makhrama radiallahu anha, she entered the masjid for Salatul Fajr when it was very dark. And she stood next to a man. And when he noticed that it could be a woman, he said to her, "Are you a man or a woman?" And she responded, "I'm a woman." He said to her, "Innaki qad kidti taftinini, fasalli fi nisa." He said to her that you almost turned me away from my salah in distraction, because he thought it was a woman. So he said, "Pray with the women." So she then went and she found a spot among the women. In summary, it's not permitted for women to lead men in prayer. But what if someone thinks this is unfair? If someone thinks this is unfair, then that's because they think that justice is equality and sameness. But this is not always the case. In reality, fairness and justice is to actually give each person, each category, each group what is appropriate for them. But how do we know what's appropriate for one gender as opposed to another? This is still a topic of intense debate even in 2025. As human beings, we can't help but to offer subjective opinions and perspectives, but the creator of the heavens and earth, the creator of us, he's defined for us what is appropriate for each gender. Some people try to cherry pick rulings that are specific to men to try to make a case that Islam discriminates against women. But we can also take rulings that are specific to women and then also make a case that Islam discriminates against men, but that would be incorrect. In Islam, as a default, rules are the same for men and women. However, there are exceptions where some rulings are specific to men and some are specific to women. For example, women are allowed to wear gold and silk. They don't have to pray or fast while menstruating. All they're required to do is to make it up later on. They're not required to attend the Friday prayer. They're not obligated to join military service where their lives would be at risk. And there's lots of other things that are specific to women. Meaning there are Islamic rulings that make things easier for them or give them an advantage. Does this mean that women are better than men? The answer is no. Likewise, if there are some Islamic rulings that are specific for men, it doesn't mean that they are better than women. So these distinctions don't mean that one gender is better than the other. The Creator knows what's most appropriate for each gender. There's actually a beautiful verse in the Quran in Surah An-Nisa where Allah talks about this very issue. Allah, He says, "And do not crave what Allah has given some of you over others. Men will be rewarded according to their deeds, and women equally will be rewarded according to theirs. Rather, ask Allah for His bounties. Surely Allah is perfect in knowledge of all things." I hope that answers that question. And if you guys have more questions, then don't forget to write it down in the comment section, and inshallah, we'll address them in upcoming videos.